Most people believe they already know who Jesus is. They've heard the stories, they've heard the sermons, they've seen the paintings, the movies, the crosses hanging on walls. They know the words, they know the phrases: love your neighbor, turn the other cheek, forgive your enemies. For many people, the image of Jesus feels familiar, comfortable, predictable. It's an image they've carried for years, sometimes their entire lives. But there's a strange tension hiding underneath that familiarity. Because when you go back and actually read the Gospels slowly, carefully, without the cultural filter that's been layered over them for centuries, you begin to notice something unsettling. The figure that appears in those texts is not always the same figure people imagine when they say the name Jesus. In fact, in many moments, the Jesus that appears in the Gospels is far more disruptive than the version people are used to. He challenges social status. He confronts religious authority. He exposes hypocrisy. He repeatedly says things that make the people around him uncomfortable, and not just the obvious villains in the story. Very often, the people who react the strongest are the ones who are most certain they understand God. The religious experts, the teachers, the people who believe they are already standing on the right side of truth. This pattern appears again and again throughout the Gospels. Whenever Jesus confronts the structures that people trust most, the response is rarely calm acceptance. More often, it's confusion, defensiveness, hostility, and eventually rejection, which raises an uncomfortable question. If the historical narrative shows us a figure who constantly challenged religious pride, social hierarchy, and human certainty, why does the modern image of Jesus often feel so safe? Why does the version many people talk about seem almost perfectly aligned with the systems and identities people already belong to? Over time, every powerful idea in human history tends to go through a similar transformation. At first, it disrupts people. It challenges them. It forces them to question the assumptions they've built their lives around. But as years pass and generations pass, the disruptive edge often gets smoothed down. The message becomes easier to digest. The uncomfortable parts become less visible. And eventually, the original figure can become something very different from what they were when they first appeared. History shows this pattern everywhere. Ideas that once challenged the world often get absorbed by it, reinterpreted, reshaped, made compatible with the very systems they once exposed. And once that happens, a strange reversal can occur. Instead of confronting human pride, the idea begins to quietly support it. Instead of challenging social identity, it becomes part of it. Instead of exposing hypocrisy, it can even become a shield behind which hypocrisy hides. This isn't unique to religion. It's a pattern that appears throughout human culture. Movements that begin as radical critiques of society can slowly become institutions themselves. Messages that once forced people to examine themselves can slowly become symbols people wear without ever asking the original question. But when you return to the earliest accounts of Jesus in the Gospels, you see something that doesn't fit comfortably into that pattern. You see a figure who repeatedly unsettles the people who believe they already understand God. A figure who warns about religious pride. A figure who speaks constantly about humility. A figure who seems almost deliberately drawn toward exposing the hidden motivations inside the human heart. And the more closely you look at those encounters, the harder it becomes to avoid a deeper question. What if the greatest tension surrounding Jesus was never between belief and disbelief? What if the real tension has always been between truth and the human ego that believes it already possesses it? Because if there is one thing human beings consistently struggle with, it is the ability to see themselves clearly. We are remarkably skilled at recognizing problems in other people, hypocrisy in other groups, blind spots in other institutions. But when the mirror turns toward us, something different happens. defensiveness appears, identity tightens, certainty grows louder, and the possibility that we might be mistaken becomes much harder to entertain, which means that the most difficult confrontation is rarely between a person and an external enemy. The most difficult confrontation is between a person and the possibility that the story they tell themselves about who they are might not be entirely true. If that pattern is real, and history suggests that it is, then it changes the way we should approach the question of who Jesus actually was. Because the central issue may not be whether people believe in Jesus. The more revealing question might be something else entirely. What kind of Jesus do people believe in? And how did that version come to exist? Because once you begin examining the difference between the Jesus that appears in the Gospels and the Jesus that often appears in human imagination, you start to notice something that is both subtle and profound. There may be more than one version of Jesus circulating in the world, and if that's true, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Which one are people actually following? If we want to understand how that happens, how a message can slowly transform into something else over time, we have to look at something deeper than religion. We have to look at human nature itself. Because the way ideas change over time isn't random. There is a pattern behind it. Human beings build systems, political systems, economic systems, social systems, religious systems. And once those systems exist, something very predictable begins to happen. They start protecting themselves. Every system develops a structure, rules, authority, status, hierarchy. And once those things are in place, the system begins to shape the behavior of the people inside it. Not necessarily through force, often through something much quieter. Identity. People begin to see themselves as part of the system. Their role in it becomes part of who they are. Their reputation in it becomes important. Their place in the hierarchy becomes meaningful. And once identity gets involved, the system becomes much harder to question. Because questioning the system no longer feels like questioning an idea. It starts to feel like questioning the person. This pattern shows up everywhere, in politics, in institutions, in corporations, and in social movements, even in something as simple as online communities. You can watch the same psychological dynamic play out again and again. Someone belongs to a group. They adopt the beliefs of that group. Those beliefs become part of their identity. And once that happens, disagreement stops feeling like a discussion. It starts to feel like a threat. Not a threat to truth, a threat to the self. Which means the system no longer has to actively defend itself. The people inside it will do that automatically. They will defend the structure. They will defend the hierarchy. They will defend the beliefs that give them a sense of certainty, even when those beliefs are challenged by new information. This dynamic has become even easier to observe in the modern world, because the systems are now visible in ways they weren't before. Look at the way people behave on social media. Millions of individuals broadcasting opinions, identities, affiliations, follower counts, verification symbols, public approval measured in likes and comments. These platforms didn't invent human psychology, but they made its patterns visible. You can watch how quickly people adapt their behavior to the expectations of an audience. You can see how identity becomes something that is performed, how belonging becomes something that must be signaled, how disagreement becomes something that must be defended against. And over time, the system reinforces itself. Certain ideas receive approval, others receive rejection, certain voices rise, others disappear. And the individuals inside the system learn the rules, even if those rules were never written down. They learn what is acceptable. They learn what is dangerous. They learn what keeps them inside the group, and what might push them outside it. This is not unique to technology. The same pattern existed long before social media. Communities have always developed shared identities. Religious groups have always formed structures. Political movements have always drawn boundaries. What technology has done is simply make the process more visible. It allows us to watch in real time how human beings respond when their identity becomes tied to an idea. And when that happens, something very important changes. The original purpose of the idea often becomes secondary. What matters most is preserving the identity that grew around it. Once that shift occurs, the system begins to filter information in a very specific way. Ideas that strengthen the group are welcomed. Ideas that threaten it are resisted. Sometimes gently, sometimes aggressively. But the direction is almost always the same. Protection of the system, protection of identity, protection of status. Which means that over time, even the most powerful ideas can slowly become absorbed into the very structures they once challenged. Not because the original message was weak, but because the human tendency to protect identity is incredibly strong. And if that tendency shapes the way we handle politics and institutions and culture, then we have to ask an uncomfortable question. Could the same thing happen with religion? Could the human instinct to protect identity reshape the way people understand a spiritual message? Could it slowly transform something that once challenged pride into something that quietly supports it? Because if you step back and observe the way human systems behave, you start to notice something. The most dangerous threat to a system is not disagreement from the outside. The most dangerous threat is truth that appears from within. Truth that forces people inside the structure to question themselves. Truth that exposes the gap between the identity people project and the reality that exists underneath it. And throughout history, whenever that kind of truth appears, the reaction is rarely comfortable. It creates tension, it creates resistance, and very often, it creates conflict, which is exactly the pattern that begins to emerge when we look closely at the encounters between Jesus and the religious systems of his time. If we want to understand why that tension appears so consistently, we have to look at something even deeper than systems. We have to look at the human mind itself, because the systems we build are not separate from us. They are expressions of the same psychology that exists inside each individual person. Human beings do not experience the world in a purely objective way. We experience it through the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Those stories form our identity. They tell us what kind of person we believe we are, what we believe is right, what we believe is wrong, what we believe makes us good. And once those stories become part of our identity, they become incredibly difficult to question. Not because the evidence is unclear, but because questioning the belief begins to feel like questioning the self. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as identity protection. When an idea becomes tied to who we think we are, the brain begins to treat challenges to that idea as threats, not intellectual threats, personal threats. You can see this reaction everywhere, in politics, in culture, in religion. People do not simply debate ideas, they defend identities. And once identity enters the conversation, something very predictable happens. Certainty grows stronger, curiosity becomes weaker. Instead of asking questions, people begin drawing boundaries. They decide who is inside the group and who is outside, which voices are trustworthy and which ones are dangerous. This is one of the most powerful forces in human behavior, because belonging matters deeply to us. Our ancestors survived in tribes. Being accepted by the group meant safety. Being rejected meant danger. Even though the modern world looks very different from the ancient one, the psychological wiring has not changed nearly as much as we might imagine. We still feel the pull of belonging. We still feel the fear of rejection. And those instincts quietly shape the way we think, especially when it comes to ideas connected to morality, truth, and identity. When a belief becomes tied to those things, the ego becomes deeply invested in protecting it. Not necessarily because the belief itself is true, but because the belief helps maintain the story we tell about ourselves. The ego is not always loud, it doesn't always appear as arrogance, often it appears as certainty. The quiet conviction that we are already standing on the right side of truth, that we already understand what is right, that we already know who we are. And once that conviction takes root, something subtle begins to happen. Instead of examining ourselves honestly, we begin examining everyone else. We become very skilled at noticing hypocrisy in other people, blind spots in other groups, errors in other systems. But the mirror rarely turns inward, because turning the mirror inward would require something the ego finds very difficult: humility. Humility is uncomfortable because it opens the door to a possibility most people would rather avoid. The possibility that we might not see ourselves as clearly as we think we do. That the story we tell about our beliefs might not be as simple as we imagine. And that our certainty might be built on assumptions we have never seriously questioned. This is why some of the most profound confrontations in human life are not external. They are internal. They happen in the quiet moment when a person begins to suspect that the version of themselves they have been defending may not be entirely accurate. And when that moment arrives, the ego has two choices. It can resist the realization, or it can allow the story to collapse. Resisting the realization is easier. It preserves identity. It maintains belonging. It avoids the discomfort of change. Allowing the story to collapse is much harder, because it means letting go of the certainty that once felt secure. But it also opens the possibility of something else. Clarity. The kind of clarity that only appears when a person is willing to see themselves without the protective layer of identity. And that brings us back to the encounters between Jesus and the people who believed they already understood God. Because when you read those moments closely, you begin to notice something striking. The tension rarely appears between Jesus and people who openly admit they are lost. The tension appears most strongly between Jesus and the people who are most certain they are already right. The people who have built their identity around religious knowledge, religious authority, religious status. In other words, the people who believe they already understand the truth. And the more confident they are in that identity, the more threatening Jesus seems to become, which raises an unsettling possibility. What if the deepest challenge Jesus presented was not simply a challenge to religious institutions? What if it was a challenge to the human ego itself? Because if the ego is built on certainty, and Jesus consistently confronts certainty, then the real tension may not have been between belief and unbelief. It may have been between humility and pride, between a willingness to see oneself honestly, and the instinct to protect the identity one has already built. And once you begin looking at the story through that lens, the encounters recorded in the Gospels begin to take on a very different meaning. They stop looking like simple religious disagreements and start looking like something much more profound. A confrontation between truth and the human tendency to defend the self at all costs. When you read the Gospels with that pattern in mind, the encounters between Jesus and the religious authorities begin to look very different, because the conflict that unfolds in those pages is not simply a disagreement about theology. It is a confrontation between two very different ways of approaching truth. On one side are the people who believe they already possess it. They know the law, they know the traditions, they know the structure of the religious system. Their authority rests on the assumption that they understand how God works. On the other side is a figure who repeatedly challenges that certainty. Jesus does not arrive as someone trying to strengthen the existing religious hierarchy. He arrives questioning it. He questions how the law is being interpreted. He questions the way religious status is being used. He questions the motivations that exist underneath outward displays of righteousness. And again, the tension that appears in those conversations centers on the same theme: hypocrisy. In one of the most direct confrontations recorded in the Gospels, Jesus addresses the religious leaders in words that are unusually blunt. In Matthew 23, he speaks directly to the scribes and Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the people widely respected as spiritual authorities. And the criticism he offers is not about their lack of knowledge. It's about the gap between the identity they project and the reality beneath it. He accuses them of focusing on outward appearances while neglecting the deeper transformation the law was meant to inspire. He describes them as people who carefully maintain the external image of righteousness while ignoring what is happening inside the human heart. The imagery he uses is striking. He compares them to tombs that appear clean and polished on the outside, but contain something very different within. It is not the language of someone trying to flatter religious authority. It is the language of someone exposing it. But what makes these encounters particularly revealing is not just the criticism itself, it is the reaction that follows. Because instead of responding with curiosity or reflection, the response of the religious authorities becomes increasingly defensive. The more Jesus challenges the assumptions of the system, the more threatening he appears to the people whose identity is tied to it. This tension builds throughout the narrative. You see it when Jesus heals people in ways that challenge strict interpretations of the Sabbath. You see it when he spends time with individuals considered morally or socially unacceptable. You see it when he overturns the tables of the money changers in the temple, disrupting a religious practice that had become intertwined with economic power. Each of these moments reveals the same pattern. Jesus confronts the structures people rely on to define righteousness. And the reaction is not simply disagreement, it is escalation. Concern grows among the authorities. Private conversations begin to take place about how to stop him. Eventually, those conversations turn into something more serious. A decision, a determination that this figure is too disruptive to be allowed to continue. The reason given for that decision is revealing. In the Gospel of John, the concern expressed by the leaders is not only theological, it is also political. They fear that the movement forming around Jesus could destabilize the existing order. If too many people begin following him, they worry it could provoke a reaction from the Roman authorities. In other words, the presence of Jesus is perceived as a threat not just to religious authority, but to the entire system that surrounds it. And once that perception takes hold, the conclusion becomes almost inevitable. The system must protect itself. The disruptive voice must be removed. When the story reaches its climax, the conflict that began as a series of debates about interpretation ends with something much more dramatic. Jesus is arrested, placed on trial, and eventually executed under Roman authority. From a historical perspective, the crucifixion was a method used by the Roman Empire to deal with individuals considered threats to public order. It was not designed simply to punish. It was designed to send a message, to demonstrate what happens when someone challenges the stability of the system. Which means the story recorded in the Gospels ends with a moment that reveals something deeply uncomfortable about human behavior. When truth confronts systems built on identity and power, the reaction is rarely peaceful. It becomes defensive, protective, and eventually destructive. But the significance of that moment goes beyond the historical event itself. Because the deeper question it raises is not only about what happened 2,000 years ago, it is about the pattern behind it. If human systems tend to defend themselves against truths that threaten identity, and if that pattern has repeated itself throughout history, then the question we are left with is unavoidable. Has that pattern really disappeared? Or does the same dynamic still exist today? Because if human psychology has not fundamentally changed, then the possibility remains that the confrontation described in the Gospels is not just a historical moment. It may be a pattern that continues to unfold whenever truth challenges the identities people have built around themselves. And if that is the case, then the question is no longer just about the religious leaders of the first century. the question becomes much closer to home. How does the human ego respond when it encounters something that threatens the story it tells about itself? And perhaps even more importantly, how would people react today if they encountered the same disruptive figure described in those ancient texts? Would they recognize him? Or would the same pattern repeat itself all over again? If that pattern is real, if the tension between truth and the human ego has been repeating itself for centuries, then the most important question is not historical, it's personal, because it forces us to consider something most people rarely examine, not whether we believe in Jesus, but what version of Jesus we believe in. Throughout history, every powerful idea eventually encounters the same pressure. Human beings reshape it. We reinterpret it through the lens of our own identity, our own preferences, our own sense of what feels comfortable or safe. And slowly, often without realizing it, the idea begins to change. The sharp edges disappear. The uncomfortable parts become less visible. The message begins to align more closely with the structures people already trust, with the systems they already belong to, with the identity they have already built. And once that transformation happens, the idea can remain widely accepted, while its original challenge quietly fades into the background. This is not necessarily the result of malicious intent. More often, it is simply the result of human nature. The ego prefers a version of truth that does not require it to change. It prefers a version of truth that confirms the story it already believes about itself. But when you return to the Gospels themselves, you repeatedly encounter a figure who does something very different. Jesus does not spend his time affirming the moral certainty of the people around him. He exposes hidden motives. He challenges religious pride. He warns about hypocrisy. He speaks about humility in ways that disrupt the normal hierarchy of human status. Again and again, the people who respond most positively to him are not the ones who believe they already possess spiritual authority. They are the ones who openly acknowledge their need for change, the ones who recognize their own limitations, the ones who approach the conversation without the protective armor of certainty. Meanwhile, the strongest resistance often comes from the people whose identity is most deeply tied to religious status. People who have built their entire self-understanding around the belief that they are already standing on the right side of truth. In that light, the central challenge of the Gospels begins to look less like a simple question of belief and more like a question of humility, the willingness to examine the version of ourselves we have been defending, the willingness to ask whether our certainty might be hiding something we have never fully confronted. Because if the human ego is capable of reshaping ideas to protect itself, then it is also capable of reshaping the image of Jesus. It can turn a disruptive voice into a comfortable symbol. A figure who once challenged pride can slowly become an emblem that allows pride to remain undisturbed. And once that transformation takes place, the difference between the historical figure described in the Gospels and the version people carry in their imagination can become surprisingly large. Which brings us back to the question that started this conversation. The question is not simply whether someone believes in Jesus. Many people do. The question is which Jesus they believe in. The one who exposes hypocrisy, the one who confronts pride, the one who calls people to humility and self-examination, or the one who fits comfortably within the identity they have already built. Because those two images are not always the same. And if there truly is a difference between them, then recognizing that difference might be one of the most important moments of clarity a person can experience. Not because it proves someone wrong, but because it opens the possibility of seeing oneself more honestly, which has always been one of the most difficult and most transformative confrontations a human being can face. This has been the End of the World broadcast.